Welcome to the Deep Dives, where we take a stack of historical sources, charters, laws, biased chronicles, and modern analysis, and dive straight into the crucial nuggets of knowledge. Today, we are peering back into the fraught, complicated heart of Anglo-Saxon England. We're going to examine a king whose name has, for 1,000 years, been synonymous with catastrophic, utter failure.
We're talking about Æthelred II, king of the English for nearly 4 decades, spanning the late 10th and early 11th centuries.
And the moment you hear the name Æthelred the Unready, you immediately feel the weight of historical judgment.
You really do. But what if that simple, damning nickname obscures a reign that was, in reality, a period of intense administrative innovation?
Right.
A cultural zenith, even. A fundamentally sophisticated state structure.
That is absolutely the central tension we need to get into today. Our mission is to move beyond the soundbite, to understand the man who, despite presiding over one of the most organized governments in early Europe, still managed to lose his kingdom.
And not just once.
Twice. He lost it twice to foreign invaders.
So to start, we really have to tackle that famous, brutal epithet.
The name itself.
Exactly. It is rooted in an ancient and, frankly, a genius political pun. His actual name, Æthelred, means noble council.
Noble council.
Yeah, it's a proud, strong Germanic name composed of Ethel, meaning noble, and red, meaning counsel or wisdom.
So he was literally named for the very quality he would historically be accused of completely lacking.
That's it. That's exactly where the pun comes in. His contemporary byname or nickname was Unread.
Unread. Okay, so what does that mean?
It means ill counsel, or, and this is maybe more devastating, no counsel.
Wow.
So by calling him Unread, the historical record, in one swift linguistic move, twisted his name into its exact opposite.
The king of noble counsel became the king of ill counsel.
It's the original piece of historical character assassination, and, it was devastatingly effective.
But what's fascinating here is the timing, right? This nickname wasn't something people were shouting at him in the street.
No, not at all. That epithet, Unread, it wasn't actually recorded contemporaneously. It doesn't show up on a political pamphlet the day after he fled.
So when does it appear?
It first appears much, much later, in the early 13th century, long after the Norman conquest. And eventually it shifted into the more familiar adjective we use today, the unready.
So it's the sheer power of centuries of hindsight shaping how we remember him.
Precisely. It creates a nickname that retrospectively justifies the conquest that happened almost 50 years after he died.
That context is just so vital because we are covering a massive span of time here.
We are.
Æthelred was king of the English from March 978, right after the chaos of his half-brother's death, all the way to December 1013, when he was briefly deposed.
The Swein Forkbeard.
Then he comes back in February 1014 and reigns until his death in April 1016. That's a 38-year reign.
An incredibly long reign, and one defined almost entirely by the disastrous resumption of large-scale Viking attacks. This is what historians call the Second Viking Age in England.
So he inherited a prosperous kingdom and left behind
a catastrophe. A total catastrophe. And we need to understand exactly how that collapse was engineered, both by external pressures and internal political decay.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. This story has to start in the shadow of regicide.
It really does. Æthelred was the younger son of King Edgar, who was, the last great Anglo-Saxon ruler before this era of crisis. His mother was Queen Æthelred.
And he was probably born around 968.
Right. And his father's death in 975 was sudden and just catastrophic for the stability of the kingdom. Edgar was only 32.
So young.
And the succession immediately threw the aristocratic elite into turmoil. This wasn't just a question of who should rule, but, which faction would rule through the young king.
And the sides were heavily defined, the kingdom split right down the middle.
Oh, absolutely. So you have Æthelred, the younger son, backed by his incredibly powerful mother, Queen Æthelred.
And some big names with her.
Big names. Bishop Æthelwold and the influential Ealdorman Elfir of Mercia.
And on the other side,
the opposing faction supported his older half-brother Edward, and they were heavy hitters too. Dunstan, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the immensely powerful Ealdorman Ethelwine of East Anglia.
So this was really a clash of the titans.
It was. And while there were debates over legitimacy and whose mother had higher status, most scholars agree this was really a contest between rival family alliances and land interests that had been suppressed by Edgar's strong hand.
Edward's claim won out at first, but he was apparently a violent and, unstable young king. He reigned for only 3 turbulent years.
And that brings us to the pivotal, horrifying event of Æthelred's early life, Edward the Martyr's assassination in March 978.
Just the name tells you how it was remembered.
Exactly. So Edward was visiting his stepmother, Æthelred, and his half-brother, Æthelred, at Corfe Castle in Dorset.
Okay.
The primary source, a hagiographer writing about Edward's subsequent sainthood, describes Edward seeking the consolations of brotherly love and being murdered by Æthelred's own retainers, his thanes, the moment he arrived.
Let's pause on that word, the vine. This is so crucial to Anglo-Saxon political life. They weren't just servants, were they?
Not at all, no. The fines were the absolute backbone of the military and local administration. They were the king's noble followers, men of landed influence who owed military service directly to the crown.
So to have the king killed by his own thanes, or the thanes of his rival's household.
It's a complete breakdown of the entire social contract. It's unthinkable.
And the assassination deeply troubled contemporaries for a very specific reason, didn't it? It was about the sacred nature of kingship.
Absolutely. The king was consecrated. He was anointed into office with holy oil, which made him literally touched by divinity.
So to kill him.
To kill a consecrated king was seen as more than a crime. It was a sin of the first order. It created this moral and spiritual taint over the whole succession.
And the real issue is that the crime went unpunished. No one was definitively named or charged in the pre-conquest sources.
That's right. And while later chroniclers point the finger directly at his mother, Queen Æthelred, modern historians are a bit more cautious.
Why is that?
Well, some speculate it might have just been the accidental result of a sudden affray, a disastrous escalation of political tension that got out of hand.
But regardless of intent, Æthelred, who was only, 9 to 12 years old at this point,
becomes the immediate beneficiary of the murder. He inherits a throne stained by spiritual crime. And that stain, this original sin, it really haunted his entire reign and was often cited by later chroniclers as the root of all his troubles.
The crowning didn't happen right away, though. It took over a year before he was finally consecrated at Kingston.
It did. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes there was much rejoicing by the counselors.
Which seems a bit strange.
It does. But this wasn't joy for the child king. As you suggested, it was probably relief that the political crisis had passed and they had a chance to stabilize the vacuum.
So he starts as a boy king, ruling under a regency.
Exactly. The minority government was led by his father's leading counselors, his mother, Ælfrith, Bishop Æthelwold, and Ealdorman Ælfr. And Ælfrith was intensely powerful, often attesting his early charters immediately after the king himself.
But the young king didn't tolerate the leash for long. What happens when he decides to break free from his regions in the mid-980s?
This is where we see the first definitive signs of the instability that would later define his kingship. After Bishop Æthelwold, who was a key conservative figure, died in 984, Æthelred dismissed his remaining regions.
Including his own mother.
Including his mother. She just vanishes from the charter witness lists for nearly a decade.
He starts to bring in a new set of advisors. New players and new mistakes.
Precisely. He was trying to assert his own independence, but he was doing it under the influence of new and sometimes self-serving favorites.
And this led to some highly controversial actions.
Oh, yes. Actions demonstrating a really worrying lack of respect for established norms and the church. For example, he savagely encroached upon church privileges, specifically ravaging the Diocese of Rochester and distributing the land to one of his royal retainers.
So this indicates a young king with poor judgment who, instead of uniting the kingdom after the murder, started alienating powerful institutions.
The church, key aristocrats, you name it, that's absolutely right.
And this pattern of paranoia and ruthlessness begins early.
It does. In 985, he exiled Ealdorman Ælfric Sild of Mercia for treason. The details are a bit shadowy, but it shows a king willing to move aggressively against powerful figures, fostering this deep suspicion and aristocratic resentment, which would come back to destroy him later.
So we've established that his political start was shaky, stained by murder, and marked by these early controversial policies. But to truly understand why he's remembered as the Unready, we have to talk about the sources themselves.
Yes.
Because they are the ultimate tool of judgment, and they are deeply compromised.
This is so critical for our listeners. If you're studying this period, you realize the evidence is not neutral. We rely heavily on the principal narrative sources, specifically manuscripts C, D, and E of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
And the Chronicle isn't a single book, right? It's a collection of records.
A collection of monastic records, copied and continued in different places. And these particular later versions, C, D, and E, were written primarily in London after the most important event of the era.
After Æthelred's death and the successful Danish conquest of England under Canute.
Exactly. They were composed between 1016 and 1023, possibly by chroniclers employed by Archbishop Wulfstan, who themselves had witnessed the collapse. They already knew Canute, the Dane, had won.
They knew the ending.
They knew the ending, and this foreknowledge, this power of hindsight, it just poisoned their entire perspective.
So they had an immediate problem. How do you explain the fall of England? And the narrative they chose was one of English incompetence, treachery, and cowardice.
And that conveniently diverts blame away from the strength of the invaders and places it squarely on the king's lieutenants.
So it's a moral explanation for a catastrophic political outcome.
It is. Historian Levi Roche notes that foreknowledge of the eventual English defeat haunts the chronicler's writing at every turn. It's an unavoidable structural bias. They frame the whole 38-year reign as this inexorable march toward the 1016 disaster.
And we can actually see this amplification of failure when we compare the different versions of the Chronicle, right?
Yep.
Like with the Viking raids of 1001.
A perfect example. So ASCA, which is the contemporary source written much closer to the event, gives a straightforward military report.
Just the facts.
Pretty much. It says local Devon forces gathered what they could but were overwhelmed at Pinho by the Viking army. It's a defeat, but, a brave effort.
But the later source, ASCC, tells a much darker, much more morally loaded story.
It does. It claims that an immense English army ran away without putting up a fight. It turns a military loss into a moral disgrace.
So the later versions are systematically magnifying the sense of English collapse and betrayal,
making Æthelred's reign look feebler than it might have felt day to day. And this negative view was then cemented by the Anglo-Norman historians who followed the 1066 conquest men like William of Malmesbury.
and their job was to justify the Norman takeover.
Of course. So they depicted the previous Anglo-Saxon kings as inept, violent, or weak. Æthelred, the king who lost his country, was the perfect scapegoat.
Now, you mentioned a surprising counterbalance to this, though. Scandinavian sources.
It's a fascinating wrinkle. Paradoxically, some Scandinavian skaldic poetry, which was meant to honor Viking heroes, actually depicts Æthelred surprisingly favorably.
How so?
Well, we have the example of Gunnlaugr Ormstonda, an Icelandic poet who visited Æthelred's court around the early 1000s and recited a praise poem describing him as a generous and dauntless prince.
Well, we know the generous part is true. He was paying huge amounts of tribute.
Exactly. But dauntless is a direct contradiction to the image of the unready. And while historians rightly treat skaldic poetry as, highly unreliable for factual history, its purpose was praise and exaggeration, it does remind us that not everyone in the North Sea world viewed him as a total failure. He clearly had moments of authority and charisma.
So where do we get the reliable, unfiltered insight into his day-to-day governance if the narrative accounts are so biased?
From the paperwork, as you might call it. We turn to the administrative record, the non-narrative sources that weren't trying to tell a story of defeat.
Okay.
So we have incredibly reliable sources like the charters. 84 authentic charters survive from his reign.
And charters are grants of land or privileges, essentially official government documents.
Yes, and they were issued at periodic meetings of the Witan, the King's Council.
The witness lists.
The witness lists on these charters provide solid chronological evidence of who was attending the highest levels of government: archbishops, bishops, ealdormen, and his key things.
So these show us the actual political hierarchy, who's in, who's out.
Exactly. It's a story of political reality, far harder to distort retrospectively than a battle description. And we also rely heavily on the law codes and the coinage records, which together paint a picture of a functional, sophisticated state apparatus, even as the military situation was collapsing.
So Æthelred is governing a state that is arguably the best administered in Europe, but he has to deal with this resurgent threat. After a generation of peace, the Vikings returned. Small raids started in 980 and 982, kicking off the Second Viking Age in England.
Initially, these were just probing attacks, likely opportunistic raids from Irish Sea Norse communities. They were minor enough that they might have been forgotten entirely if they hadn't, set the stage for the massive fleets that arrived in the 990s.
But those initial raids had an immediate and maybe unexpected diplomatic consequence, connecting England to Normandy.
That's right. The diplomatic activity resulting from the raids led directly to a major treaty in 991 with Richard II, Duke of Normandy.
And the Pope was involved.
It was mediated by the Pope, John V, and it stipulated that neither England nor Normandy would harbor the other's enemies. This was a critical security measure.
Because it suggests the Danish raiders were using Norman ports.
Exactly. It strongly suggests they were using them as logistical bases. Æthelred was trying to cut off the pirates' supply line.
And then everything just escalates dramatically in 991, the year of the Battle of Malden.
This is the turning point. A much larger Danish fleet ravaged Ipswich and landed near the Blackwater River estuary. The English response was led by Ealdorman Bertnoth,
An aging but fiercely loyal nobleman.
who led a local militia to meet the invaders.
And this event has been immortalized by the famous Old English poem, The Battle of Malden. What does that poem tell us about the climate of the time?
Well, the battle itself was a crushing English defeat, resulting in Bertnoth's death. But the poem captures the ultimate Anglo-Saxon virtue: absolute loyalty to one's lord. It details the heroic resistance of the thanes who chose to fight to the death rather than desert their fallen leader. It acts as a powerful moral counterpoint to the later chronicle accounts, which emphasize cowardice,
So it proves that there was still immense martial spirit and loyalty.
but that the overall military strategy and coordination were failing.
The shock of Malden led directly to the policy that has forever defined Æthelred's reputation: the decision to pay the invaders off.
Yes. The king and his council, the Witan, advised by Archbishop Sigeric of Canterbury, decided to pay a tribute, orgafol, to the Danes.
And the first payment was huge.
£10,000, a massive sum, paid specifically because of the great terror they were causing along the coast.
We need to clarify the terminology here because these tribute payments are often just lumped together.
They are, and it's important to distinguish them.
So what's the difference between this first payment, the gaeful, and what came later?
This first gaeful was explicitly a one-off payment, essentially a ransom to make this specific army leave.
Right.
It was not yet institutionalized.
It's crisis management.
Exactly. It's crucial to distinguish this from the later, much heavier, an annual tax that came to be called the herregeld, or army tax. The gaeful was desperate. The herregeld was a settled system of state extortion.
And critics view this as weakness. But historical context shows it wasn't always a poor strategy, right?
Modern historians generally agree that, in the short term, it was a sensible, pragmatic move. Other successful leaders, like Alfred the Great and Charles the Bald in Francia, they adopted similar policies.
But protect the people.
To protect the civil population, their livestock, their homes. It was a way to buy time, save lives, and crucially, keep the functioning agricultural economy intact while the military situation was being addressed.
The problem was that the payments didn't stop. They just trained the Vikings to keep coming back for more.
And the cost escalated quickly. By 994, the Viking army returned, led by two major figures: Olaf Tryggvason, the future king of Norway, and Swein Forkbeard, the formidable king of Denmark.
The scale must have been terrifying.
It was. They besieged London, though they failed to take it, which demonstrates London's immense strategic importance.
And the price of peace went up.
To £16,000, for a promise that the attacks would cease and the fleet would leave.
But in the middle of all this desperation, Æthelred managed a really sophisticated diplomatic maneuver. A flash of brilliance.
This is a moment of clear success that often gets overlooked. Æthelred sponsored the confirmation of Olaf Tryggvason, who had probably been baptized earlier.
And what did that achieve?
Olaf, receiving gifts and an honor guard, promised never to return to England in hostility. And he kept that promise. He left to establish his rule in Norway, and some of his men were even retained by Æthelred as paid mercenaries.
So it shows he was capable of decisive, sophisticated diplomatic action that actually got results.
With Olaf, yes. He buys 3 years of peace from a major threat, but at an astronomical financial cost that is just draining the internal economy.
Right. And this brings us to a part of his reign that really complicates the Unready label, this period of reform and administration.
This section is absolutely vital for the listener because it provides the counter-narrative. In the period immediately following the shock of Malden and the first major tributes, Æthelred undertook a massive internal shift.
He seems to have had a change of heart, a kind of moral reckoning.
He did. He began viewing the Viking victories as divine justice for his earlier persecution of the church. Remember ravaging Rochester and dismissing his mother?
Yes.
By 993, he had accepted the long-standing critique from church reformers that his reign was tainted by moral failure. He convened a meeting of the Witan with the stated goal of being free of the terrible curse as quickly as possible.
He's actively trying to stabilize his position by aligning himself with the moral authority of the church.
And he didn't just quietly reconcile. He made a huge public spectacle of his repentance, which is captured in the Charter S-876 of 993.
What's so special about that charter?
S-876 is one of the most powerful and insightful documents we possess. It's one of the grandest original charters surviving, and in it, Æthelred publicly and formally disowned his earlier policies.
And he blames his youth.
He blames the ignorance of my youth, but also, and this is key, the abhorrent greed of certain of those men who ought to administer to my interest.
A public political purge.
Absolutely. It was a formal restoration of land and status to the church, and he's blaming figures like Elfric of Hampshire.
This marks a shift in his political management. His mother, Æthelred, she comes back into the picture.
She does. She gains renewed status in his charters, and ecclesiastics, bishops, and abbots become much more prominent signatories on these crucial documents. He's stacking the deck with people who prioritize moral order.
And he smartly tried to neutralize the most potent political symbol of his failures, the murder of his half-brother, Edward.
He did. Æthelred actively promoted the cult of Edward the Martyr. He founded Cholsey Abbey dedicated to Edward, and then in 1001 he ordered a second translation of Edward's remains to a highly prominent position in Shaftesbury Abbey.
That's fascinating. He's trying to co-opt the moral authority of the saint whose murder put him on the throne. It's a brilliant political move.
It is exactly that. It's an attempt to legitimize his rule by embracing the spiritual debt incurred by the crime.
And despite the Viking pressure, this period of reform, the late 990s and early 1000s, is characterized by enormous, sophisticated achievements in governance.
It really is.
So let's dig into the evidence that this was a well-run state. Where do we see this sophistication?
First, in the central administration, we have evidence of a highly organized central writing office. Charters were not just, scribbled documents. They were drafted centrally. Royal instructions were sent out across the entire kingdom.
And the royal seal.
The royal seal was used uniformly as the proof of authenticity. This requires training, organization, and a highly literate staff. You should not underestimate the degree of sophistication in managing official business.
And this centralization extended right down to local governance, giving us one of the most enduring administrative roles in history.
Yes, this is when the royal official known as the shire reeve, the king's representative in the shire, or county, is first recorded in this form.
Who we know today as the sheriff.
The sheriff, exactly. And the shire reeve wasn't just a local bigwig. He was the king's direct link to local power.
He was the direct agent of the crown.
Absolutely. Responsible for practical duties, collecting money and taxes, arranging local courts, enforcing royal decrees, and, critically, organizing the military forces, the Fiferd. This level of centralized control was pretty much unique in Europe at the time.
And the coinage provides another stunning example of this functional state machinery.
It truly is a marvel. Æthelred continued the standardized coinage system inherited from his father, Edgar, but he applied the principle of frequent recoinages even more effectively than before.
Meaning he called in all the money.
The entire kingdom's currency was called in, melted down, and reissued with a new design every few years, sometimes as often as every 6 years.
Why do that? Why not just let the currency circulate?
Two main reasons. First, it was a massive revenue stream. The king charged a high fee for the exchange, essentially taxing the money supply constantly.
Yeah.
And second, it ensured the purity and standardization of the currency across dozens of mints, guaranteeing trust in the medium of exchange. This model influenced later European coinage for centuries.
And the designs themselves, they reflect the political climate.
They do. The hand types, with the hand of God, represent that early period of reform and repentance. Then came the hugely important crux type.
And that's the one found in Scandinavia.
In massive quantities. It's the first late Anglo-Saxon coin type found on a large scale in Scandinavian hordes, which suggests it was the primary mechanism for transferring those massive early tribute payments overseas.
So the coinage proves that even though the money was flowing out, the centralized mechanism for raising it was incredibly robust.
Precisely. And in terms of pure legislative output, Æthelred's reign is unmatched. He produced between 10 and 12 surviving law codes, more than any other Anglo-Saxon king before Edward I.
And the quality of this law, especially in the 990s, is considered the peak of Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence.
Yes. Take the Wantage Code of 997. This law applied specifically to the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw: regions heavily settled by Danes.
So it's not for the whole country.
Right. And the code is remarkable because it incorporates specific Scandinavian legal usage and vocabulary. This shows the royal administration was expert enough not only to control far-flung, historically separate regions, but also to integrate complex, regional, non-English legal traditions into national law.
That requires an extremely detailed, educated, and well-organized civil service. But then the nature of the law changes dramatically, driven by this intellectual giant, Wulfstan, Archbishop of York.
Wulfstan was arguably the most important intellectual figure of the time. He wrote the later codes, particularly from 1008 to 1014. And Wulfstan fundamentally changed the tone of the law.
How so?
He used what is described as the language of the preacher. He blended homilies and legal ordinances.
So the law literally becomes a sermon.
In essence, yes. For Wulfstan, the Viking threat wasn't a military or political problem. It was a punishment from God. He explicitly connected sins and crimes, urging the nation to return to piety to appease God.
The famous Sermo Lupi ad Anglos.
The Sermon of the Wolf to the English, the ultimate example of this. It's a fiery polemic blaming English moral decay for the current disasters.
And this internal intellectual and administrative push culminated in a genuine cultural zenith around the turn of the century, a remarkable flowering of intellectual activity.
This is the moment when some of the finest Anglo-Saxon illuminated manuscripts were being created, the illustrated Gospels, and we have the major literary works of Ælfric of Eynsham, whose writing is described as the highest pinnacle of Anglo-Latin literature.
So we have this incredible paradox, a state that is intellectually vibrant, legislatively advanced, and runs its money supply flawlessly.
Yet it is simultaneously hemorrhaging money and territory. The political infrastructure was solid. The king's personal judgment, however, was about to fail catastrophically.
Okay, so this brings us to the descent. The fragile peace bought by those first great payments did not last.
Not at all. The military situation returned with a vengeance in 997. Danish raids resumed annually, now systematic, targeting Cornwall, Devon, Dorset, and Kent. They were learning the routes and the weak spots.
The expense must have been staggering. He bought peace again in the spring of 1002, this time for £24,000.
More than double the first payment. The cumulative financial burden was enormous, and it created this atmosphere of fear and desperation inside the court.
And the only break was in 1000.
Which Æthelred used actively. He ravaged Cumberland and attacked the Isle of Man, retaliating against Norse Vikings based in the Irish Sea. He could fight back when given the chance.
But he was always reacting defensively.
Always. And then we hit the moment that historians seize upon to define Æthelred's erratic cruelty and paranoia, the St. Brice's Day massacre in November 1002.
We really need to slow down and emphasize the drama of this moment.
This was a desperate, horrific act. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that Æthelred ordered the slaughter of all Danish men in England on November 13th.
And what was his justification?
His official justification, recorded in a later charter, was based on intelligence that the Danes were planning to treacherously deprive him and his counselors of life and seize the kingdom.
This action suggests a king utterly consumed by fear and suspicion.
Exactly. It's interpreted by historians as a clear, dark sign of his desperation and paranoia. He was seeing internal plots everywhere, unable to distinguish between genuine threats and peaceful settlers.
So what was the likely scope? Was he trying to kill every single person of Danish descent?
It's unlikely. It seems to have targeted recent immigrants, Viking mercenaries who had settled in places like the Five Boroughs, and those who were known to be politically opposed. But where it was carried out, it was merciless. In Oxford, Danes who sought refuge in a church were burned alive.
This single bloody act, even if limited in scope, was the worst possible political error. It virtually guaranteed massive retaliation.
It was a monumental strategic mistake. Swein Forkbeard, king of Denmark, returned in 1003. And while the story that he was avenging his sister Gunhilde, who was allegedly murdered, is debated,
The massacre certainly gave him the justification he needed.
the moral and political justification to wage a war of conquest, not just raiding. He systematically sacked Exeter, burnt Wilton, Norwich, and Thetford.
But even in this disastrous phase, there are still flashes of English resistance.
Absolutely, which contradicts that chronicle narrative of universal cowardice. In 1004, an English army led by the East Anglian nobleman Ulf Seidel fought the Danes. The English suffered a defeat, but they inflicted such heavy losses that the Danes themselves reportedly acknowledged they never met worst fighting amongst the English.
So the English could fight when properly led, The problem was coordination and command.
Exactly. And while the external threat was raging, Ethelred engineered a political purge internally, a palace revolution, around 1005-1006.
He was desperate to find someone else to blame.
He concluded his failures were the fault of corrupt advisors. He forced 3 leading Thenines into retirement or confiscated their land. This created a political vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped the man whose name is now synonymous with treachery, Ædric Striona.
Ædric Striona, what a name. Striona literally means the gainer or the grabber.
And he was ruthless. He rose rapidly to become the most powerful counselor, dominating the witness lists of the Wheaton meetings.
And he seems to have been behind much of this internal instability.
Consolidating his power by eliminating rivals, he was likely behind the murder of Ealdorman Elfhelm of York, capitalizing ruthlessly on the king's growing paranoia.
So, Æthelred, seeking loyal servants, instead promotes a man who is actively destabilizing the aristocracy for his own personal gain. This is the definition of ill counsel.
It perfectly illustrates the tragedy of his rule, and the decline became ignominious in 1008. Æthelred, demonstrating the power of his administration, ordered the construction of a massive fleet of warships.
A major, impressive national investment.
But this effort was immediately undermined by internal aristocratic feuding, driven by Ædric and his allies.
What happened?
The feud was petty but fatal. Ædric's brother, Britric, accused a Sussex nobleman named Wulfnoth of unknown crimes. Wulfnoth reacted by deserting with 20 ships and ravaging the coast.
And Britric chased him.
With 80 ships, and the entire pursuit fleet was wrecked in a storm.
80 ships, a massive national military effort, paid for by the already overtaxed populace, lost in a squabble between 2 aristocrats.
This disaster created irreparable loss of morale and a deep sense of national futility. The remaining fleet was retired to London, too afraid to risk further losses. The English defenses were fundamentally broken.
The final collapse began in 1009, when the most formidable force since Æthelred's accession landed, led by Thorkel the Tall.
This army was organized, disciplined, and massive. English resistance collapsed completely by 1011. The Vikings were moving at will across the countryside.
London held out.
London held out repeatedly, proving its loyalty and resilience, but the surrounding countryside was being devastated.
And the ultimate humiliation came in September 1011 with the seizure of Canterbury and the capture of Archbishop Elfia.
The English council was forced to agree to a colossal tribute of £48,000. The Vikings then demanded an additional ransom for the archbishop.
And Elfia refused,
He refused to let his already impoverished people pay a single penny more.
resulting in his brutal martyrdom.
In April 1012, drunken Vikings murdered him, pelting him with bones from their feast, despite Thorkel the Tall's personal attempt to protect him. This was a deep spiritual and political humiliation for the English church and crown.
And after this,
After the payment of the enormous tribute, the main Viking army dispersed, but Thorkel the Tall and his personal following of 45 ships entered Æthelred's service.
as mercenaries.
Paid for by a new institutionalized annual tax, the Herregeld. This tax, the final legacy of the tribute policy, would institutionalize the cost of national defense for decades to come.
So by 1013, the objective of the Danish forces had shifted entirely from raiding and extortion to outright conquest.
Completely. Swein Forkbeard invaded with the explicit intention of making himself King of England.
And his campaign was swift.
Brutal and strategically brilliant. He landed in the north and systematically secured the submission of Northumbria, the 5 boroughs, Oxford, and Winchester, without having to fight a single major battle. The political will to resist had just evaporated.
London remained the last loyal holdout, defended by Æthelred and Thorkel's newly hired mercenaries. But with virtually the whole country under Swein's control, Æthelred had no choice but to flee.
He first sent his wife, Emma of Normandy, and their children across the Channel, securing the loyalty of his in-laws. He then fled to the Isle of Wight before joining them in exile in Normandy. For the first time, Æthelred had lost his throne.
But the political situation changed on a dime. Swein's reign as King of England was incredibly brief.
He died just 5 weeks after conquering the kingdom in February 1014.
This sudden death created a political vacuum, and the English magnates seized the chance to return to their traditional allegiance.
They showed a basic underlying loyalty to the consecrated English dynasty, but they would not do so unconditionally.
This is a constitutional moment of massive importance. What were the magnates' terms for bringing the king back?
The councillors sent a deputation to Æthelred, but their message was stern. He could only return if he would govern them more justly than he did before.
The message was clear. Your failures were political, and we will tolerate no more arbitrary power.
It was, and Æthelred agreed. He sent his son Edward to greet them, promising he would be a gracious lord and reform all the things which they hated.
And he had to forgive them for submitting to swine.
A formal pardon. This exchange is considered the first recorded pact between an English king and his subjects. It illustrates in stark terms the limits placed on the arbitrary power of the crown.
So his past failures had given the aristocracy legal leverage to demand reform.
It's a moment of political sophistication that often gets lost in the narrative of failure.
So Æthelred returned, drove Canute, Swine's son, out of the country, and the kingdom was briefly, tentatively restored.
But Canute did not leave quietly. He ordered the savage mutilation of his English hostages, hands, noses, and ears cut off, a brutal reminder that the war was far from over.
And the restored regime was fragile, and it soon shattered because Æthelred, despite the pact, quickly repeated his most fatal error.
Poor judgment and patronage and a return to ruthless paranoia. Yes, the lesson of Ædric Striona was not learned. In early 1015, Ædric, now back in favor, murdered Siegfried and Morcar, two powerful thanes in the North Midlands who opposed him.
And this was likely ordered by Æthelred.
Or at least tacitly approved. This serious error of judgment immediately destabilized the North and demonstrated that the king's promise to govern justly was hollow.
This act also precipitated an open, devastating rebellion from the one person who should have been his greatest ally, his oldest surviving son, Edmund Ironside.
Edmund was a fierce, charismatic warrior, utterly disgusted by his father's reliance on Ædric. He rescued Siegfried's widow, married her without royal permission, and openly seized the dead brother's lands,
Setting up a rival power base.
in defiance of his father. And the English unity was shattered just as Canute returned. The timing couldn't have been worse.
Canute returned in force.
And Ædric Striona, the ultimate pragmatist, immediately defected with 40 ships to Canute's side, realizing that Dane was the coming power. Wessex immediately submitted.
So the final effort to unite English forces failed.
The suspicion between the ailing, paranoid father, Æthelred, and his rebellious, independent son, Edmund, was just too great. The king, suffering from poor health and fearing further betrayal, soon retired to London.
He died there.
He died in London on 23 April 1016, a king who, right up until the end, was battling his own son and his own unreliable lieutenants while a foreign power conquered his realm. He was buried in Old St. Paul's Cathedral.
The war continued under his son, Edmund Ironside, who demonstrated the kind of vigorous military leadership his father had lacked.
Oh, he was a true warrior king, fighting 5 battles in 7 months, but the division in the country was too great. Edmund eventually agreed to divide the kingdom with Canute, taking the lands south of the Thames.
But Edmund died shortly thereafter.
In November 1016, and Canute became the undisputed king of all England.
And what about the poetic justice for the ultimate traitor, Ædric Striona?
A year later, Canute had him murdered. The ultimate traitor received his just deserts, not from the king he betrayed, but from the king he served.
A clear signal from Canute that there was no place for such self-serving disloyalty in his new unified kingdom.
A very clear signal.
Finally, let's look at the family legacy, because it's a line that runs directly through English history.
Absolutely. Æthelred had many children by his first wife, including the valiant Edmund Ironside. But his second marriage to Emma of Normandy, sister of Duke Richard II, was perhaps the most consequential political move of his life.
Because of their children.
Their children included Edward the Confessor, the future king, and Alfred Atheling. These connections ensured that the House of Wessex and its ties to the burgeoning Norman dynasty would remain critical.
Setting the stage for 1066.
Exactly. The seeds of the Norman conquest were sown in the diplomatic desperation of Æthelred the Unready.
So we've seen a king who presided over periods of exceptional administration, yet whose reign was ultimately consumed by personal and political failures. When we look at his legacy, the traditional condemnation, championed by 19th and early 20th century historians like Frank Spenton, is brutally harsh.
Stetton viewed him as a classic, weak, incompetent ruler whose failings stemmed from the original trauma of his half-brother's murder. Stetton argued Æthelred behaved like a man who was never sure of himself,
Citing his ineffectiveness in war, spasmodic violence, and deep mistrust of his nobles.
all as signs of a psychological failure rooted in the regicide. This psychological view that his character doomed the state was dominant for decades.
But since the 1970s, a new generation of historians, Simon Keynes, Pauline Stafford, Levi Roach, has offered a massive, necessary partial rehabilitation.
They have, and their core argument is that Ethelred was not entirely incompetent. His failure was not systemic across the entire government, but due to a combination of impossible external circumstances.
The overwhelming strength of the Viking armies.
Organized, state-level Viking armies, led by major kings like Swein, and the simple fact that he lived too long, giving the crisis time to wear down the state structure.
So we can't let the catastrophic ending overshadow the significant successes of the middle of his reign.
Absolutely not. They stressed that his government saw positive and enduring achievements, particularly in the late 990s and early 1000s. The sophisticated legislation, the coinage, the shire reeve system, the intellectual flowering.
And what about the tribute payments? Were they really proof of weakness?
The modern view is that the policy of paying gaffel, while ruinously expensive, was a sensible strategy in the short term. It bought time to build up defenses, fortify towns, and commission the fleet.
Which he did attempt in 1008.
Even if that effort was later ruined by aristocratic feuding, the policy was fundamentally sound, but its application was undermined by political disunity.
So if the administration was so robust, why did the kingdom ultimately fail? Where was the critical structural weakness?
The failure was political and personal, specifically concerning the king's relationship with his aristocracy. As historian Anne Williams notes, the tragedy lies in his inability to control the rivalries among his counselors. His ultimate collapse stemmed from his excessive support for and reliance on favorites, like Edric Striona.
Men who repeatedly used the king's paranoia to betray the realm and destabilize unity.
So he was a king who could initiate spectacular reform, but whose paranoia and catastrophic patronage choices rendered every success moot, leading to national disaster.
Levi Roach sums up Æthelred's life as a tragedy. A ruler who, despite energetic and resourceful efforts, could never achieve the peace and victory his people desperately needed.
And the most fitting epitaph, drawn from the contemporary chronicler, remains the most neutral and perhaps the most heartbreaking summation. He held the kingdom with great toil and hardship for the length of his life.
That phrase, with great toil and hardship, is such a powerful final image. It strips away the punitive judgment of Unready and leaves us with the sheer, unrelenting difficulty of governing a sophisticated state under impossible external pressure.
It does. We've seen a kingdom capable of complex legislation, currency control, and intellectual vigor, a structure that really should have been unshakable.
Yet that same sophisticated state proved uniquely fragile because, as we discussed, its unity was centered on and symbolized by the person of its king.
Anglo-Saxon England was structurally centralized to the point where the personal character of the monarch was the ultimate linchpin.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. Given the centralized nature of the English kingdom, where all power flowed from the king to his shire reeves and his thanes, were Æthelred's personal flaws, his paranoia, and his chronic inability to choose loyal magnates guaranteed to become national disasters.
If the system demanded absolute unity focused on the king, did the monarch's psychological failings inevitably translate into the systemic collapse of the nation? It raises the crucial question of where historical failure truly lies, with the overwhelming external forces, or with the flawed, arbitrary power vested in the individual leader at the very top of a highly functional but brittle structure.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the ill-counseled king. We hope you leave here well-informed and certainly more ready to discuss the complex reign of Æthelred II. We'll see you next time.